it's bringing in the sphere of influence the Eastern European countries. I think it's gone quite well. You've heard some examples of joining omelets, providing fillers, and providing subject matter experts in some of the Polish brigades. I'd say the same thing with the Polish division that worked in Iraq. Always had a 15 to 20 cell of Illinois Guardsmen that participated and assisted them with every one of their deployments. Many of the omelets from most of their Eastern European countries came with a 50-50 split of their partner U.S. soldiers from the Guard with those countries. And it really did is it helped their support and with the training and ensuring that they had continuity with the understanding of what was going on in Afghanistan, knowing that they could talk to U.S. forces there because they had partners that they had worked with for many years. So you look at the map, and I think the first question is, why all those other countries? It doesn't make any rhyme or reason. Where's the prioritization? Why more in South America, very little in the Pacific? I will tell you, here's how state partnerships come about. It's usually an agreement between the chief of mission, the country, and the... Sure.
I'm a retired General Paul Lima, and I spent 5 years as the Deputy Combatant Commander for U.S. Southern Command. And in the period of time between 1998 and 2003, when I was there at Southern Command, of those 22, 16 of them we developed at that time. And it was done first of all at the joint level because we were looking at both the Air National Guard and the Army National Guard in terms of the state partnership programs, and we looked at both of those, and we had both of the components, the Army and the Air Force, involved as we developed the state partnership programs. And it was all developed in accordance with the strategic plan that the Joint Command had for the region. That's how we developed it, and I'm glad to see that there are a few more, but it still has stayed alive, even under these circumstances. But it was developed at that level, very well thought out as we put it together thought many years ago, and it was some of those were on board well before what was going on in Eastern Europe. So I just wanted to kind of say that as a matter of history.
No, and you're absolutely right. So it was the GCC commanders saw a vision, had a vision, and realized what state partnership could do. It always takes the chief of mission to get that country, because that country has to say, yes, we want a state partnership, because if they don't want it, it won't be successful, and we won't push it on them. So it takes a commitment from that country. It takes the chief of mission to say, yes, that's what I want in my country, and then it takes the geographical combatant commander to say, yes, I'm supportive of that. So then it becomes a DOD and a State Department agreement, and that's how it becomes. And it's not always easy, but I think everybody works pretty hard to make it happen when a country in a chief of mission and the geographical commander all align and say, yes, we want it to happen. What I'll say is this last year, 4,228 Army National Guard soldiers participated in exchanges in those 65 state partnership programs. What General Campbell asked me to bring up is we have a program that we started about 2 years ago called Bilateral Assistance Officers, BAOs. We have Army National Guard soldiers who are on active duty, active Guard Reserve duty, Title 10, that actually become part of the embassy team to assist with exchanges and, when needed, assist with exercises and other things that maybe the ASCC commander needs help with. He's there or she's there, and they're a tool for the Army. What I'll caution, though, is we don't have them everywhere. Resources don't allow it. We've got 40 out of 40 of them are Army, and I think another 10 or 15 are Air Guard. But eventually we'd like to get to having them all filled and then sustaining them because we've just seen the tremendous value. In FY12, the Army National Guard provided 25,751 soldiers who were employed in theater security operations, exercises, or operational missions to the ASCCs. For example, Beyond the Horizons in U.S. Southern Command, Southern Accord in U.S. AFRICOM, and then Conquest and UFG in South Korea and Mongolia as well. So we're there, we're part of the team, and again, it is usually associated with once the capability can't be found with units that are assigned, then you go to RTIMS and you ask for that capability, and it's run through Forces Command after it's been validated by the theater, and Forces Command ensures that we can meet the requirement and that the right unit gets to the mission. I talked a little bit about, or mentioned the reciprocal small unit exchanges. This past year in FY12, we did 4 units, 240 soldiers, providing about 3,125 man days with Israel, Germany, Norway, and the United Kingdom. And OSD-RA is currently working to enlarge this in FY13 by including Denmark. And these are reserve component to reserve component exchanges. These are countries that are committed to having a professional reserve component, and they've asked us to do these type of exchanges. And then the other one is the officer and NCO exchange program. 72 Army National Guard leaders participated in that program, 1,152 man days with the United Kingdom in Germany this year.
You're not going to give them a test on these numbers at the end, are you?
No, sir, just showing the level of effort. And that's all I have, sir.
Okay, everybody stand up again. All right, if you're in the building, I cut your brakes, sit back down. All right, if you're from a foreign country outside the United States, stand. Everybody else sit down. All right, our next question. Sure. Sure, 2 of them. Come on, each of you grab a mic.
So I wonder if you could just comment on what's been presented thus far. Comes across slightly as being a bilateral between the United States and the country with which you're engaging. I just wonder whether you might touch on how you coordinate and deconflict with some of the other players who are going to be in there, some of which will be potential coalition partners and some of which will be probably anti.
Yeah, no, good question. I'd leave it up to combatant commander. I don't know if there's another answer than that.
Yeah.
You know. So the Army, the United States Army, as I told you up front, wants to get the right soldiers at the right time with the right training in the right place. We're going to give those to the ASCC commander. But I'm dependent upon Frank in PACOM to work that with Admiral Locklear to make sure he's tied that in, not only the other countries that are involved, but the other services as well. So it could be Marines, could be Air Force, Navy, Coast Guard, whatever. The combatant commander, I think, has to deconflict that. I'll let you guys talk to that as well.
Well, one of the things, we don't just do bilateral exercises or training with a country. We also try to enable the regional standby organizations and security organizations in Africa's case, like the Eastern Standby Force or the SADC or the Western, the ECOWAS standby force. So we do, sometimes, you know, it's hard to get them in as the focus of the exercise, but what we do is we'll have it like in Ghana, and they'll invite all of the ECOWAS countries to that particular exercise, so it's not just Ghana, and we will get the training by having like 8 bilateral relationships show up at that particular training event. So we do get the regional effect that you're talking about.
And in the PACOM AOR, what you start to see are trilaterals that are starting to form. That literally, because again, the width and depth of the AOR makes sense where they are. You'll start to see United States, Australia, Indonesia. You'll also see Australia, Japan, and the United States. We'd love to be able to continue to work our way up to United States, Japan, South Korea as a trilateral, because we know we're all going to be involved should something occur that's there. And then you have some truly multinational events that are pretty major in the way they're done. Talisman Saver, Cobra Gold, even UFG now, quite multilateral and joint in the way they're being operated. And the tendency is more towards that direction than in the other.
Hey, sir, if you can hold your question, I'll come back to you. All right, what I want to do now, up front I said, Frank's going to talk a little bit about this, Pat's going to talk a little bit about this, Jeff will this, Tim. I have no clue what General Barnow's going to talk about. So, I just want to put that caveat up front, sir. So with that, sir, I'll turn it over to you.
No responsibility, that's what that is, absolutely. Well, I'll be brief because we're kind of in the closing minutes here, and there's probably a number of additional questions. But a couple thoughts maybe from looking at the challenge here from outside the Army for a moment. And part of that is kind of looking at the other services in the same space. Part of it's looking at, I think, challenges within the concept, still concept work in progress on regionally aligned forces. And as I look at this kind of in my day job, thinking about where the military is going, where the Defense Department is going, one of the ways that I kind of see the Army in this period is beginning the second huge transition from what we've done in the last 25 years. The first big transition came at the end of the Cold War in 1989, 90, early 90s period, involved a large drawdown of the force from 781,000 down to in the neighborhood of 482, huge change, about 40% reduction in the Army. Also involved some of the Army coming back from overseas, but still a pretty substantial presence in Europe. The second big transition that we're about to start now, and is already underway, is the transition out of two major wars that at their peak had over 250,000 Army soldiers deployed in combat in Iraq and Afghanistan. The end state of that today in Iraq, about several hundred Army soldiers there. The end state in Afghanistan, not yet clear, but probably only several thousand Army soldiers there at most at the end of 2014, just 2 years from now. So as we talk about the demand signal right now and the challenges on those deployments continuing, recognize that based on what I heard last night in the debate at least, the plan right now, no matter what happens on 6 November, is that we're going to see essentially that deployment to Afghanistan move to its end state at the end of 2014, which probably is going to be several thousand troops, certainly not tens of thousands of troops, I don't think. So the Army is, in a sense, is now coming home from the wars. It's coming home from overseas for the first time since World War II. In fact, I think chances are 2, 3 years from now, 4 years from now, if we in fact only have a few thousand troops in Afghanistan, we have only 2 brigade combat teams in Europe, and we have 1 brigade combat team in Korea, we'll have over 90% of the Army based for the first time since about 1940 in the continental United States, in the 50 United States at least, Alaska, Hawaii, and the lower 48. So that's a completely new dynamic for the United States Army looking back over the last 70 years. And everything we have in the Army has been built around a overseas rotation model, first in the Cold War, both focused on the Pacific, in Korea primarily, and focused on Europe, and now focused on Iraq and Afghanistan. So as we go to a new model for the Army that requires the Army to be relevant and capable, it's going to have to do that from bases that are now almost entirely in the United States of America. That's something no one in this audience can remember. Looking back in history, because no one was alive during that period of time. It's going to be a very different world. So I think the regionally aligned forces, in a sense, is making virtue out of necessity. The Army is going to have to be out forward in order to compete in this space, in order to be relevant, in order to engage with countries around the world. And for the first time in 10 years, the Army is going to be focused more, in my estimation, on conflict prevention as a primary strategic purpose. That's the prevent and shape part of the model, instead of conflict, which is what we, the Army, have been doing for the last 10 years, the win part of the model. So that's going to require us to take a very different approach around the world. And I think, again, going to a regionally aligned forces model, one that's still in its early stages, is exactly the right thing to do. But there are some caveats on that. And there are some significant challenges as I look at that model competing with the other services that we need to be aware of. In the case of really the other 3 services, but certainly the Navy and the Marine Corps, they have forces that are funded to operate forward on a perpetual basis. The fleet operating in the Pacific in particular, but in the Med and the Persian Gulf, the Marine Expeditionary Units that are out with the fleet. Those two services in particular are funded to always be forward with a significant rotational presence. I'm not saying that's either good or bad, but I will tell you that that's how the Congress of the United States looks at funding the Marine Corps and the Navy, that's what their models are built on. There isn't a model for the United States Army that's built on significant rotations of Army forces overseas in peacetime. We haven't done that before. We've been based overseas. And so, to one of our questioners here today, how you have a funding model that captures that demand by the combatant commanders to have the Army now start deploying for exercise and for engagement overseas is hugely important, because best I can tell, and no surprise to anyone in this room, belts are getting tightened, dollars are coming down, and you're going to have, we the Army collectively are going to have a very compelling model to why it makes sense to fund the Army, which really has always been funded for combat readiness, not operating overseas, not being forward deployed and operating, to change that model such that the Army gets to deploy overseas and do these things. So I think that's important to know. So some other just final thoughts on some challenges out there, and a couple of them I thought have been raised by some very excellent questions by a number of folks in the audience. How this model becomes institutionalized to lend itself to continuity in having the same focus for units and for individuals in the force, so that you don't have a brigade combat team that spends 2 years focused on Africa, and then 4 years later it's focused on Southeast Asia, and 4 years after that it's focused on the Middle East. That's probably not a productive use of talent in the force. So we need to think about how we do that. We need to think about the language skills and the cultural skills. And again, focusing units on regions is a really good way to do that, but it can't be one region today, another region tomorrow. I think there's great utility in the Straight Partnership Program, and one of the reasons that it's so effective, and I think every speaker up here talked about going out into foreign countries across their AORs and finding nations out there who talked about their National Guard counterparts. That's because of relationships. That's because they were the same people from the same units making the same contacts year after year after year after year. And so as the Army begins to move in this direction, and if we've learned nothing else in the last 10 years of war, it's the importance of having relationships built with key players in countries that we're trying to influence. And if we are strategically now trying to move the Army to a significant role in conflict prevention, building those relationships, keeping those same people and same units and same focus oriented on countries overseas, I think will be extraordinarily important. Last point I think I'd make is just the whole issue of an overseas focused Army based in the United States, in challenging the Army leadership to think through, since this is really the first time we've had an Army with that kind of a physical setup here in the US of A, and having a requirement to commute to the fight, if you will, or commute overseas to be effective and to be engaged. What else does that change about how the Army does business? What does it tell us about PCS moves and how often we should do that, as one of our speakers mentioned? What does it tell us about regional specialization as a career, either for an individual or for a unit in a certain part of the country? I'm tickled to hear that we're going to have corps and divisions aligned now, because that may give us some continuity over a long period of time, because people do go back to those same units. But we need to think about that and make sure that if the Army is serious about this, we put the right institutional investments into building all those supporting functions in the Army, the personnel system, the assignment system, the alignment of units into this overseas focus. Because it won't work if it's simply, this year's a good idea and it doesn't get followed up by all those great institutions that support the operating forces in the field. So I'll leave it at that, and I'll look forward to questions across the board. Thank you.
Sure, thanks. One of the other things I talked about, broadening assignments, let me just throw out there as well, that the Army's taking a hard look at is how we do our FAOs and what training and where we go forward on the whole FAO program. So I think you'll see some very good movement down the road as we look at our FAOs. Okay, questions? Well, let me give the opportunity to over here first, and then we'll come back to you. That was only half a run around the corner, then you stopped, but okay.
If I may, I have an observation first and then a question. My observation is one of curiosity, really. We're talking about regional alignment, and I'm curious that there's no State Department representation on the board. The question I have is to do with SC Battle. I've been getting quite engaged. I do work in the building as an exchange officer. I've been getting quite engaged with the SC Battle debate in my day job, and with some dismay, because I don't much subscribe to it personally. I've also been surprised at how long it's taken for the Army to present their perception of their part of that debate, including the Joint Operational Access concept and the access element of it. Really what I'm curious about is whether you feel there might be a role, as the Navy and the Air Force are, I think, relatively logically switching their focus to the Pacific, whatever their motivations might be, for the Army to focus on what are, I think, undeniably the much more likely flashpoints militarily over the next 10 to 15 years, while China remains very much in the rearview mirror of military development.
I'll start and then ask for some help here. No, that's a great question. You know, air-sea battle has been around for a little bit. Air-sea battle, and I think Admiral Locklear will tell you the same thing, is really a TTP. It's a bunch of PowerPoints, I heard him say one time. But it is something that the Army is involved with. There's an air-sea battle office. We have Army officers assigned in the air-sea battle office to make sure that we can contribute to where that's going, mostly focus on anti-access, anti-denial. And so I think there's still a lot to be learned there. If you talk to George Flynn, J7 of the Joint Staff, he'd tell you that air-sea battle is just a subcomponent of what you just talked about before, and that the Joint Staff had to get out in front of that piece of it. I think they're starting to do that. But I think we'll learn some lessons there as all the services work together. And I think really what the Army and the Navy, the Navy and the Air Force, my own opinion, is they've been working that hard because they've taken a hard look at potentially down the road, and a lot of what they're working is material solutions, which costs a lot of money, and they've looked at that piece of it. And frankly, the Army's been doing some other things for the last 10 or 11 years for our nation. But I think you'll see as we move forward. You heard the Chief talk about his vision today. If you were at the lunch, I showed you the vision statement up there. I think there's a place for air-sea battle. I think that all of our vices of our services have signed a memorandum of agreement that talks about the concept, and we want to take that. And it's not just Air Force and Navy that signed that, but all of the services have signed that. So I think you'll see us work along, and that's a joint endeavor, I think, that's going to work over time. But air-sea battle, people think equate only to PACOM, and that's not the case, but I'll let Frank add to that. He sees and has talked to Admiral Locklear many times on air-sea battle.
And thanks, John. And quite frankly, I don't see it. And I don't see the difference. I really believe that we're operating jointly. I don't see us separating out the Air Force and the Navy from what our operations are. The Air Force works in the air domain, the Navy works in the sea domain, and we work in the human domain and on the land. And I don't see how you can separate that by coming up with a concept, air-sea battle. And quite frankly, we don't operate that way. So for me, it's kind of just a nifty term out there. And I don't see it. I see us operating, quite frankly, on a day-to-day basis in a joint environment, international, multinational, interagency, intergovernmental, and that's the way we're going to fight any fight. And when I'm talking about fights in anybody's theater, it spans the entire spectrum. I'm not just talking about flinging bullets downrange. In our AOR, the only thing I can tell you is going to happen this year, we're going to have a natural disaster, guaranteed. And we better be prepared for it. It's just a function of where we live in that ring, and that takes all of us. And you have to be prepared across the spectrum for it all. So to answer your question very simply, I don't see it.
I did take a comment on the State Department rep. That's a great AR comment for us, and I'll work that. That would have been a great ad here. I can't tell you why we don't have one, but okay. Let me get first time guy back here, and then we'll come back, because you're a repeat offender, I think. So we're back in the back.
Tom Goodcoop.
Dave, this question is more for you. the G3 heard this yesterday in a slightly different group, and we got a lot of the intrinsic goodness of the RAF and exchange programs, et cetera. But as you mentioned, as dollars start to decrease, how do we gather metrics and determine ROI on these programs so that as budgets fall, you can go to your friends and others in CAPE and say, this is the metric that we did for getting this, and this is why we should take this part of the dollars and put against this program or that program, as opposed to funding additional CTC rotations or other similar training activities?
I don't have any friends at Cape, first of all. You can tell Bob Lennox that if you want, but go ahead, sir.
Yeah, briefly. I think one of the things I've been tinkering with a little bit, and I think it might be worth giving some thought. We're going to go through, obviously, another compression here on the defense budget. I anticipate, you know, regardless of what happens in November. And I think that one of the things we ought to be looking at for each service is coming up with some funding models. In the case of the Army, it might be a BCT funding model. What does it take to have a fully ready BCT in terms of dollars? What does it take within that to have a deployment capability to get that BCT out to do some of this engagement? We typically have not, and this is true I think of each of the services, have not built models that have suggested, you know, to keep the tip of the spear sharp, here's what the tip of the spear looks like, here's what it costs to do that, and here's what it costs to keep it trained, and here's how you employ it in peacetime to get conflict prevention benefits from it, to save you those times 10 or times 100 costs that you're going to rack up if you have to go to war. I don't think we've made the case adequately enough that the engagement that the ASCC commanders and the folks we have out in the theater do, you know, are cost avoidance. That prevents not only immense monetary costs to the United States, if you can build capacities among your partners to tamp down some of these problems, but obviously the human cost savings is huge. So I think the Army is right at the sweet spot of being able to do that. And I think as we look at a model where Army forces are now going to be much more involved in supporting COCOMs around the world, that building a cost model that includes the conflict prevention aspect of the utility of those forces ought to be built in. And that's one of the arguments we ought to be taken forward for how we preserve this force and why there's a ROI, you know, trade-off that makes huge sense to be able to fund these kind of forces.
Sure, and we are doing a lot of work, and all the services have been talked to really to come up with a model that, you know, that we can all explain. And Todd McCaffrey's back there in the back that does that for me. The Army, over the last several years, talks in terms of miles. That doesn't make sense, but that's a component that goes into it. We switched, you know, it was tank miles, went to full spectrum miles. We're looking at another name, but essentially underneath all of that, all the op-tempo, the direct and indirect costs that go into that, we have a pretty good idea. But as we've, and the Chief talked a little bit about it, a 19-page Army training strategy that just was published. We'll get at how we think we're going to have to get after this next couple of years. It's going to involve a lot more live, virtual, constructive, and gaming on there, and we don't know the cost of that. We're going to try to become more efficient, but I think that's something that we'll continue to take on. I think one thing we didn't talk about here, as we talk about cost, though, and I know for the Chief, it's all about readiness. And so as we look at the regional line of forces, the key for the Chief is to make sure that he's doing everything and as it pertains to readiness. And our problem in the Army has been that we focus on the USR, the SRU, and we're looking at a report that comes out in the middle of the month, and we're looking at the last 30 days, and that's history. And so at my level, we got to look at strategic readiness. And so the Army is getting ready to publish in draft AR 525XX or something like that, that'll look at strategic readiness and really taking lessons learned from the last several years, pushing that out to the forward. And there's been a lot of work put into that that really gets into the details on some metrics that I think are very, very good, that talks about things that we haven't measured in the past. It really does tie into readiness, like resiliency and some things like that. So I think that's going to be very important.
I think maybe the answer part of this question, sir, that not the cost of our training, but the rate of return investment. You know, what was worth doing, and we're actually trying to look at that in U.S. Army Africa. You know, is it you get more bang for a buck from an exercise or from a mill-to-mill engagement? And it's really hard to say, but if you look at, like, we had the Kenyan Army took Kismayu, and no Americans, we trained them and they did it on their own. I mean, there are ways of perhaps showing the investment how that is worth it, and that we can have that be part of our message. That's something we're looking at to give you some feedback so we can make the case for why we're doing what we're doing on the African continent.
So we hit our time limit. I'll turn it back over to you for any final comments. And if you have further questions, I know that Frank and Pat will stick around on the stage for at least the next hour if you want to get those answered.
Well, I want to thank you very much on behalf of General Sullivan. We got an opportunity here in the next couple of years. Obviously, there's some significant challenges out there as you look at regional realignment. One of the things that obviously has got to be accomplished through the combatant commanders and the Army component commanders is to do a missionary analysis as you look at these regional alignment of forces to make sure you got the right capabilities. But that's also an opportunity for us to go in and look at defending the type of capabilities we need, because that's going to define requirements, and that's going to define the force structure, and it's going to define the things we need as far as training, the transportation assets for exercises and those kinds of things. And hopefully we're going to have a complementary process being done at the Joint Force area. And as General Campbell mentioned, right now we enjoy a very, very strong relationship within the interagency arena. But as the war wanes, without some kind of forcing function out there to ensure that we have those continuing relationships in the future, that's going to be a challenge if we don't address that for regional alignments. And if we don't have something like JIATUS, Joint Interagency Task Forces, where the interagency is embedded in there on a routine basis, we're not going to be as responsive as we need to be for the next crisis. But on behalf of General Sullivan, Institute of Land Warfare, and AUSA, I want to thank you, the entire panel, for a great discussion. Appreciate it.